Um, all right. Hey, everyone. I want to welcome you all to the third panel here for the PEAC and Global Shapers Leadership and Service Series. I'm really happy to see you all. My name is Vishal Kurvanka. I'm the CEO and founder of PEAC, and I'm going to be the incoming vice curator for the Houston Global Shapers Hub next year. A little introduction about our speakers here today. Bernadette is a senior associate consultant at Bain and Company in Houston. She's originally from Nigeria and moved to the United States to study economics at Drexel University. She has a master's degree in financial mathematics from Washington University in St. Louis and has had previous work experience in the financial services industry. Outside of work, Bernadette is passionate about mentorship, women's empowerment, African development, travel, and building strong relationships with families and friends. Our second panelist is Jonathan Steirer. He's a naval architect and a marine engineer based in Cleveland, Ohio, and he's currently the curator of the Cleveland hub of the Global Shapers. Jonathan works extensively with navigable rivers and inland and waterways, as well as more traditional commercial naval architectural work. Additionally, he has been active in the Society of Naval Architects and Marine Engineers since entering college in 2011, previously serving 2 terms on the Society's Student Steering Committee, and now serving as the communications chair for the Great Lakes and Great Rivers section of the United States. Outside of his day job, Jonathan is passionate about public transportation, sustainable cities, safe and complete streets, and fair housing, most recently working on redefining the relationship between landlords and tenants. He's an avid cyclist, a pedestrian, and loyal public transit rider. And our final panelist is Bukky Esho. She is Nigerian and moved to the United States in 2016. She has a bachelor's degree in civil engineering and a master's in environmental engineering and business management. Bukky currently works for a consulting company called Arcadis and serves both public and private sector clients. She is very passionate about volunteering for social causes, impact, and sustainability. She loves to cook, travel, and learn about other cultures. So thanks again to our great panelists for coming out today, giving us their time, just to speak a little bit about themselves, their careers, and how we can better serve our community. So with that, we can go ahead and get started here. So Jonathan, can you start us off here and just share a little bit about your industry and your current job, what you do?
Sure. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. So I, as mentioned, I'm a naval architect, marine engineer, and it's not a job that I think a lot of people encounter very often. We're definitely split into a few hubs throughout the world. In the United States, the big hubs are Seattle, Houston, the Atlantic coast, sort of around Virginia, the Chesapeake Bay, New York, and then a little bit up in New England, and then some stuff along the Gulf Coast in general. So I personally do not work with any military contracts. We're an entirely civilian commercial firm. As mentioned, I do a lot of work with rivers and inland waterways, which is also kind of a area of U.S. commerce that a lot of people don't think about. But the Mississippi River, for example, is a massive sort of backbone to the U.S. economy for movement of goods. And so I kind of work with some terminal design on the Mississippi. I do some environmental compliance work, government regulatory work, things like that, and then also some kind of real actual engineering design work. But in general, for people looking to get into the industry, you really look at kind of a couple academic paths. There's a handful of schools in the United States that offer this curriculum. It's the University of Michigan is the big one. Webb Institute is another one, and then there actually are some schools in Texas. University of Texas Galveston is, for example, is a campus that has some curriculum in this space, and then also in Florida and things. And then you can also go the Merchant Marine Academy route, which are also civilian colleges, but they're structured like the Navy, which is a requirement of the U.S. Coast Guard if you are interested in shipping out, which is a whole other world. So that's anyone who works on a commercial ship is licensed by the U.S. Coast Guard. So you're a civilian, but you're on a ship. And so if you're interested in being involved in engineering, but you like the prospect of being on a ship in the ocean, it's a very interesting career path, and there are some pretty accessible options for people, and it's definitely a unique experience. So, yeah.
Thank you for that, Jonathan. Bukky, you want to kind of share a little bit about yourself?
Okay, yeah. Hi, everyone. Michelle already introduced me. My name is Bukky. Have a master's from Texas A&M in College Station, environmental engineering and business management. So just a little bit about my industry. What we do is basically anything environmental related. And so I'm on the engineering side. So we do a lot of designs, we do a lot of compliance work, we do a lot of inspections. And one primary key thing that we do is majorly designing wastewater and water treatment plants. So that's a heavy part of what we do. And attached to that is also a lot of asset management work. We also help our clients manage their operational and maintenance budget. And that's on the public side. On the private side, we help out a lot with environmental inspections, compliance and regulatory requirements, and majorly sustainability issues. So that's basically, what I do. And then just like Jonathan mentioned earlier, like I said, I moved from Nigeria, and Texas A&M was a great university that provided me with a lot of knowledge in my area. So I would say that's one school that I would recommend if anyone is trying to consider or look for school, that they can get a good degree in environmental engineering. So.
Thank you for that, Bukky.
Mm-hmm.
Bernadette, you want to share a little bit about your industry and job?
Yes, of course. So hi, everyone. I'm Bernadette again. I work in management consulting, which isn't necessarily one industry, but on a high level, what we do is work with companies and nonprofits to solve business problems. Now, these companies may be from a variety of industries. So it might be a company that's into oil and gas, or it might be somebody that's like into retail, for example. And we work with them to solve a variety of problems. So for example, if a company is trying to improve profitability, or if they're trying to enter into a new market, we might help them think about what makes sense and how to go about it. We also work with nonprofits. So for example, as part of my work, I've worked with a charter school to think about what their 5-year goal strategy should look like, or with a nonprofit focused on environmental and plastic waste to think about how and where to build structures to reduce plastic waste in Asian countries. So it's a bit different, it's a bit varied. I think a lot of people that come into consulting, and maybe people like me who are unsure exactly where they want to pitch their tent or where they want to specialize in from an industry perspective, and kind of want to try a bit of everything first and maybe decide down the line. So happy to answer any questions from this group on that as we move along.
Thank you. It's great that we have such a diverse set of speakers today, and I'm sure the students will benefit from anything you guys have to share. So one of the questions that we've been hearing a lot is, how has the needs of your industry changed due to the pandemic? And we've got a lot of varying answers, and I think hearing from you guys, especially a lot of you working in sustainability, business and engineering, I think would be good for students to know what's still relevant and how things are changing now.
Yeah. I can. Do you want to go ahead?
Go ahead, Bukky.
Okay. One thing I've noticed, or one thing that my company has done, is basically just moved a lot of our activities to being virtual. And so I think that's a very key area where people need to build their skills in becoming more digitally inclined. Even just this past week, we usually, for example, if a private client is going through a certain challenge and they don't really know what sort of what to implement in their company, we usually go through like a session with them called a design thinking workshop. And that's usually like a face-to-face kind of workshop where you go in with the client, you sit down with the client like for a whole day, try to do some empathy mapping and things along those lines. And so we've had to move that to being virtual. And this is the first design thinking workshop, which I have held virtually this week, and it was great. So that's one key thing that I would say would be the need of. I don't even think it's going to be just the engineering industry. I'm going to think I think it's going to be across board, regardless of what industry you are. You know, you have to be digitally inclined. That's one key thing I've seen. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I'll completely echo that, Bukky. Like, we've completely moved to a virtual world, doing workshops that would typically be in person with like post-its everywhere on Zoom also as well. I think the other thing is because of the pandemic as well as other factors, we also have the case of oil prices being really low, and that impacts a lot of our clients. So a lot of people are focused on thinking about how to plan for worst case scenarios in the future. So how do you put things in place that are adaptable and kind of resilient, so that if you're in this kind of situation in future, you know, you don't just collapse, you have enough cash, for example, to keep going. There's been a lot of more concerns from the clients on how to think about planning for downside scenarios.
Yeah, I think engineering specific to ships is a little bit delayed, I think, in feeling changes to the economy. It takes the ripples a little longer to get to us, just in general, because the industry is a little bit siloed off, because it is very heavily dependent on, you know, the movement of goods that still does kind of need to continue. That being said, we've seen clients sort of take pause and say, don't bill any more hours to this for now. We're not going to close this project, but we're going to hold off on the next steps. And there's been just a much more elevated sense of caution around everything, and just being much more careful about where they're spending their money. So we're still feeling a slowdown in that regard. And then travel obviously didn't happen. So last summer and into the winter, I was actually flying to Houston pretty often because I had to drive out to Port Arthur because I was doing work in a shipyard in Port Arthur, Texas. And so obviously like that level of travel wasn't really happening. But right now, my company, because it's small and is a little bit kind of considers itself, you know, an essential function, they've been pushing to get us back to normal. So I've been back in the office for a couple of weeks now. A lot of people up here still are working remotely. But outside of work, the things that our Shaper Hub is involved with, which is much more people-to-people and outward-facing work, was grinded to a halt initially, and it was really tough because we were working with high school students. We were working with other nonprofits. For example, we were trying to address food deserts and access to food. And things like that have been very hard because those systems are already so delicate and tedious that you introduce something like COVID and just, you know, quarantine and just general pandemic cautions into something like trying to connect people who face food insecurity to people who can maybe provide food. And the connections are totally severed. And so it's been kind of trying to build new stuff from the ground up, also while not being able to meet and work face to face, which was very difficult.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. I think moving everything online has been huge. Just having those skills, knowing how to navigate it and being able to thrive in this environment, I think is something that, you know, I think students are getting better. They're just getting used to it now. But I think really practicing and understanding, you know, how this stuff works is important. And I think this is a good segue to our next question here. So a lot of times students usually, you know, ask us, how did you get to that field, or why did you pick that field? Because I don't really know what I want to do. And so I think it'd be good for them to hear about, you know, your all's journeys on how you currently got to the role that you're in, right? So was there any experiences that, you know, led you to pick the job that you're currently in? Was there an internship, a mentor, you know, something like that made you choose the field you're currently in?
Yeah, I'm happy to share here. Well, I guess I should start by saying when I started college, I didn't know that the job I currently do, I didn't know it existed. I wasn't aware that it was a job that existed. And so I think I started by just following what I was curious about, and maybe had the fortune of knowing what I didn't want to do. So my father is a doctor, and I was very aware I didn't want to do that, for example. And I think that removed some of the options. So one started with following what I was curious about and interested in. I was like, okay, I like economics, let's study it. and see where that takes us. And then in college, you have people that are within career services. Sometimes you'd have alumni that would come that are working in different industries. And so I attended a lot of those sessions to try and understand what was out there. I went to a school that was called a co-op school, where you could do 6 months working and 6 months in school for 3 years. And I think that helped me also kind of narrow down what I wanted to do and what I didn't want to do. But it honestly wasn't until my last year, so my senior year in college, that I really knew what management consulting was, because I had spoken to somebody that had gone into the field. And I ended up deciding to go there because I knew that I was interested in economics. I knew that I liked thinking about business problems, but I wasn't sure if I wanted to focus on one particular like industry yet. And so it felt like, okay, this is a good way to stay broad and do work in a different variety of sectors. I really wanted to be able to do nonprofit work as part of my work, and I saw the opportunity there without specializing. So for me, it's been one, just following my interest. I think I used to be very bored into thinking about like, what is my one great passion? But I think even just following, okay, what am I interested in? And then talking to as many people that are in the field as possible to even understand what's out there. And then getting internships can help sort of narrow down what you might like and what you might not like as much.
Yeah, thank you for that, Bernadette. I can continue with that. For me, in high school, I really loved math. Although I struggled a little bit, but I ended up falling in love with that subject, math. And so I knew I wanted to do something in the lines of engineering, but I wasn't quite sure what type of engineering I wanted to do. But because my dad is a civil engineer, he sort of talked me into getting a degree in civil engineering. However, his own focus or specialization in civil engineering was structural engineering. And so in college, he told me to go to the UK to get like a 6-month internship in structural engineering. It was fun, but I wasn't quite pleased. I wasn't so chilling. So I was able to cross that out. So like Bernadette like Bernadette said, you having some sort of internship, even if it's a work shadow, would be a good way for you to determine what particular path you want to go through, because that internship just helped me cancel out structural engineering, because I was like, okay, this is not for me. And so after college, I volunteered with a nonprofit, and what we did was just in lines of sustainability, awareness, and just helping out make the environment better. And I was like, okay, this sounds good. And so I found out that environmental engineering is actually sort of a part of civil engineering. And so that was what led me to getting a master's degree in environmental engineering. However, as I was doing that, I also found out that I really liked the management side of things. And so what I did in my master's degree was to combine my technical classes with my management classes. So at the end of the day, I got the best of like both worlds. And now I'm doing consulting, but it's just majorly in the engineering space. So I would say like internships helped me, and just finding out the particular subjects that I was very strong in and the ones that I wasn't particularly strong in. That sort of helped me.
Yeah, I remember the exact moment. I was like, this seems interesting. Or I guess I didn't know at the time, but my 3rd grade classroom had an ocean liner disaster book in it, and I was obsessed with it. I thought it was fascinating. And I just kind of stayed really interested in ships, just as, you know, this casual interest of mine. And then when I was in maybe 5th or 6th grade, I actually had a neighbor who printed out like the Wikipedia page on naval architecture and just gave it to me. And that's the first time I realized it was a field that someone could pursue. And I kind of stuck with it. It's sort of like, you know, an object in motion will remain in motion, and, you know, unless acted upon by an outside force. And there were no outside forces having me consider other paths. I didn't really have a guidance counselor in high school, and no one in my family ever went to college. And so there was no one really challenging that my plan that like, I'll do this. And I stuck with it. And I went to a college also that was very narrow in scope. So I went the Merchant Marine Academy path. I don't ship out now, as you can see, because I'm on land. But I went to a Merchant Marine Academy. I went to Maine Maritime Academy. So everyone that's there is pretty much, it's curriculum specific, kind of why you went there. So again, you're not really necessarily exposed to other disciplines, or you don't only have the opportunity to pivot to a different, major should you want to, because all the majors are just pretty much the same. And so it's been a fascinating experience, but kind of along the way, I always had this other interest in housing, which is another thing I never really knew how a person could work in. And so now, kind of while I'm exploring different paths in my day job and kind of finding what is my specialty here, as I'm getting into things with rivers and more environmental concerns related to the work we're doing and how it impacts the environment and some geotechnical stuff, I'm also figuring out how to operate in this space related to housing challenges. And I think the big takeaway I would have to offer to people kind of further back on this path is really remain open, which I think has been reflected so far, is they remain open to other things you might end up being passionate about, because you might have two very distinct but equal passions, and they definitely can, I think, coexist and complement one each other, maybe in disparate ways that you don't expect, because obviously ships and housing security aren't really related, but I think there's ways to kind of reconcile your interests.
I really like that the physics reference you gave there. An object in motion will stay in motion. No, I'm just a big physics fan. I don't know why, but thank you for those for your journey, guys. I think it was very powerful to hear from all of you about how you guys got to your specific jobs. So our next question, right? We have a lot of people here that are interested in sustainability and environment. So one of the things that a lot of students have been asking us is, how can we get involved? What are things we can do to kind of further push these sustainability goals, right? So what are some things that these students and the youth can do on a daily basis to further these sustainability goals that we have?
I can start off answering that question. I think one thing that the youth can do is basically just create awareness. I think that would be a good place to start. I'll give you an example, right? When I moved to America, I was surprised, or maybe because I came straight to Texas, straight to Houston, I was surprised to find out that we didn't have separate trash cans for degradable and not biodegradable products, right? Everything just went into one place. And I was like, wait, this doesn't, and I guess maybe people just didn't know better, right? And so even in my office, I try to say, okay, guys, the blue can is for recyclable items, the other one is for non-recyclable items, So that's sort of like a way to create awareness, encourage people to use non-plastic stuff. For example, if you're trying to reduce plastic waste, for example, if you go out, I got an aluminum straw, which I carry around and I reuse, rather than using plastic straws. If you go get your groceries, just carry a reusable bag. Those are great ways to start to create awareness and just to let people know that, look, you're trying to make the earth and the environment inhabitable for the future generation. Because if you continue in status quo, in 150 years to come, the earth is not going to be a good place for anyone living in it. So that would be a great way to start.
Yeah. I would agree. I would echo a lot of what Bukky said. I think also just because personally, I wasn't really, until I was on the case that was focused on plastic waste, I honestly hadn't thought about it that much. If I'm being frank, I would go to the grocery store and I'll use my plastic bags and just keep it moving and not really thinking about, what happens to this plastic bag from here. And I think working on that case and really understanding the degree of the problem and the impact on the earth and the impact on fishes in the sea, and how there's so many smaller behavior changes that can go a long way if you get enough people, a mass of people to adopt it, was really illuminating for me. So I think just creating awareness of the problem of behavior changes that move us to a better world is a great first step.
I also like to approach the topic of sustainability from a systems thinking perspective. And I think educating people around the ways that so many different things are actually connected is a way to really kind of maybe surprise some people. It doesn't win everyone over, but it's a start sometimes. And so, as I mentioned in the little intro bio, is I do a lot of public transit advocacy and biking advocacy and alternatives to driving advocacy. And it's a huge factor of economic mobility for people that have less economic freedom, and are a little bit more locked in to kind of a smaller geographic area. It helps connect them to jobs and to better housing, but so it's this social cause, but then there's the environmental implications that fewer cars is reduced pollution. And if you, in theory, switch from public transit to biking, it even changes that dynamic even more. But then it's like, are our streets actually safe for people to ride a bike on? And a lot of the time they're not. And so helping people think about other topics that they might not think about that often, and helping them see how it's connected to things that actually do impact them. Because if you're saying, well, we're reducing the number of cars, traffic's not going to be as bad for you. And then they have some personal stake in it. And so I guess we found in working with high school students on topics of sustainability that helping them figure out a way to appeal to people with a bit of an emotional plea tends to maybe win some people over. And so there's the things like helping reduce trash and waste, because people don't like litter, and litter is a huge issue up here. People have a personal connection to that because they visibly see that they've made a difference and they feel better about it and they're happier. But then connecting that to these other bigger quality of life issues, like maybe you should care about if the bus is accessible to people, because here's all the ways it makes your life better, even if you don't want to ride the bus.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, no, I think those are all, I think awareness and, like you said at the end, Jonathan, adding that emotional part of it is a great way of just telling people and getting people involved. And, moving to our last question here, you guys are all dynamic individuals working on these projects, what are some ways, like you guys are doing these projects right now, right? How did you guys come to do those projects? And, what are some other ways that our youth can make an impact in their local communities? Because that's one of our main focuses here at PEAC, right? And Global Shapers is how can we make an impact on the community? And we just wanted to hear from, you all about if you guys had any recommendations.
I think visibility is a huge issue for youth that want to get engaged, because I think a lot of people that are in positions of power tend to overlook how much power youth actually have and how invested they actually are in their communities. And so in one sense, it's I think very helpful for those organizations to see youth kind of self-organizing and trying to make their voices heard. I understand that's very difficult to do if you're not already within some type of structure that helps you advocate for yourself and elevates your voice. So I would say finding out what is the issue on around which you'd like to sort of coalesce and engage your community about. So if sustainability is one, potentially identifying some type of organization or group that's already active in the space that you could potentially get a foot in the door with, and then use it as kind of a springboard to really launch yourself further into the community. It's super difficult to go at it alone. So that's my initial thought. I might have a more succinct response when we get to the Q&A session, but that was my knee-jerk reaction.
Pretty good.
Yeah. I'm sorry, Bernadette. Go ahead.
No, we keep doing this. I was just going to echo what Jonathan said, because I completely agree. The only thing that I'll add is when you're part of the organization and when you're interacting with the people that are impacted by whatever issue it is you've decided to get involved with, just keep listening. I think sometimes I've worked with, organizations where there can be a misalignment with what people actually really need and what's actually being done if you're not continually listening to people. So going there, like he said, figure out, okay, what am I interested in? Where do I want to get involved? Find an organization that's working on it. And then once you're in there, just keep listening to people.
Mm. Yeah, I 100% agree with what Jameson and Bernadette said. What I had on the top of my head was just volunteering. That's a very good way to make impact. Find what your passion is, what you're particularly interested in, or the problem you want to try to solve, and then look for like an NGO or like an organization that you can be a part of, whose vision and mission is aligned with that interest of yours. And like Bernadette said, always listen, and even also probably create networks within your smaller community, and maybe like ask them, okay, what are we lacking? What is it that we need? And just tying it back to the first question that Vishal asked, you can go digital and just start to talk about those things, if on social media, on Facebook, on Instagram, or whatever way you want to do it. You can create a website, and then just advocate for that cause that you're very passionate about.
Thank you. The reason we asked this question was because a lot of youth recently have been wanting to do things right in their communities. They wanted to organize, and I think what they just wanted to kind of hear what are some ways they can start to do that. And I think all of that was really powerful for them. So moving into the Q&A now. So if anyone wants to come off of mute or type it in the chat box that I can read, we can start there. And I think actually someone already asked a question, so I'll go ahead and read that. Emily said, will you speak on behalf of farmers who are throwing away milk crops during COVID because of too much supply? Why is there a solution when they could instead donate the food to food banks?
Yeah, so I actually can speak on some of the barriers we've hit with that, because that's still one of the challenges we're trying to tackle. A little bit of it is just there aren't open lines of communication necessarily between the farmers and the end user. So a lot of, if it's a smaller scale farm, some of them rely on specific stores to stock their product, and then some of them were trying to get rid of excess product at things like farmers markets. But even farmers markets aren't really functioning, or they're getting back off the ground. But I know there was some challenge in actually being able to sell all of the surplus through those those avenues. A bigger issue we found is that something like a food bank or any other nonprofit that is giving away food, some of them have really strict restrictions on what they'll accept. So some of them will only accept prepared foods because it's a health concern to take unprepared foods, or even if they would take unprepared foods and it's not a concern about health regulation for them, they don't necessarily have the facilities to store it until they can get it out to the community. And so we're trying to still solve the issue of how do you deal with this bulk product that there isn't an existing kind of vehicle to get it to people right away. Mm-hmm. And I think on the farmer side, some of it is that it just in terms of it's less resources for them to just let it go bad or destroy it than it would be for them to sink the resources into trying to find new ways to get rid of it, if that makes sense. So there's a lot of waste in the system, and we haven't fully figured out on our end the best way to remove it, at least specific to this region. There are some kind of sharing economies elsewhere in the US where they've used sort of app-based platforms to just connect farmers with excess product to people who can just go get it. And that's a really kind of elegant, simple solution. We just don't have that here yet. And at least the organizational partners we have right now are shying away from the app because they don't have the ability to take some of those supplies and turn them into prepared food. And then also they're concerned about, like I said, the health regulations around it, because they just don't have staffs to perform quality control and make sure they don't accidentally give bad food to a family.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it looks like there's a lot of moving parts in that problem. Really complex.
It's wild.
Yeah, no. I mean, I think I can speak on Houston. There used to be someone that they used to go to these farms, I think, and collect them and donate. Mm-hmm. But I think that someone, it has to be like a collected effort. But yep, thank you for that, Jonathan. So I think the next question was to Bernadette. Shashrik is asking, could you talk a little bit about your experience going through a financial mathematics program?
Sure. So the program, the financial mathematics program, it's very similar to what the name implies. So it's a combination of finance classes that may be, for example, if a company wants to acquire another company, how would they evaluate how much they should pay? Or if I was going to invest in a portfolio, how would I decide what to invest in? So that's more sort of the finance part of it. And then there's the more mathematical component that's then focused on, there's a bunch of equations, for example, that you might do to figure out where to invest. How do you actually prove those equations? What goes into stress testing this from a mathematical perspective? So those are the two main arms. And then there's another bucket that's related to coding. So taking classes in using code to solve problems. So you might take a class in Java, or you might take a class in MATLAB to do like statistical analysis. I'm not sure if this is where maybe Shashrik's question was headed towards, but let me know if that's helpful, or if there's something else I can shed light on that may be more helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I think, even building on top of his question, Bernadette, do you like actively use those things that you used in your degree on an everyday basis, or?
No. The short answer is no.
No, I mean, it's something, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think that there are people that do, because there's so many. I think the thing about economics and finance is that there's so many different industries that you can go into. So there are lots of people that from our program went in to get PhDs, and so they build on a lot of the math that they learned in our program. There are people that went into pricing, so figuring out how to determine the price of a financial instrument, and so they might use more of the algorithmic coding classes that we learned in their work. I think because the work I went into is a bit more broad, some of the classes that we've used are maybe the classes on how you decide how much to pay for a company you're acquiring, for example. But I find that I use more of the stuff that I learned in my undergraduate program in economics in terms of thinking than the stuff I learned in my master's degree. So I actually don't use a lot of it on a day-to-day basis. But the thinking is very important. So for example, I took a class in Java, and I think that's probably the class that's been most similar to what I do in consulting, even though I don't code in Java. But because you start with a problem, and then you have to break it down into segments, and each segment needs to work, and then how each segment works determines whether or not you solve the overarching problem. And that's very much a similar thinking that I use in consulting. So I would literally like write down a framework of how I'm going to think about this. And I think I learned that from Java. So even though I'm not using code, I'm using some of the thinking that I learned during the program.
Yeah, I totally agree with what you're saying. I think maybe not, I took a mathematics and economics degree, and I was just wondering, because a lot of, I think the problems that we encounter in the real world are not really, cut and dry like they teach it to us in school. So you have to use a lot of critical thinking, and I'm sure it's the same in the engineering and sustainability industry. So thank you for that. I think Vaishnav said, "What do each of you believe are Gen Z's most defining challenges?" It's an interesting question.
I do think climate and environment is going to be probably just the overarching theme of the next couple of decades, in terms of just kind of dealing with the fallout from sort of where we've gotten ourselves to this point and trying to dig ourselves out of the hole, and then all of the new systems that are going to be required basically to deal with the world in its current state. And then I think what encourages me about Generation Z is that as a group, it seems like everyone is much more willing than previous generations to sort of question the legitimacy of basically every system and construct in society, which, I think it's great to, be able to embrace that type of abstract thinking and also challenge every single status quo. I think that, jumping back to getting involved in your community question, sometimes you just need to be loud and really advocate for yourself, because sometimes there won't be groups doing what what you feel needs to be done, and you need to kind of create a new path going forward. And I think Generation Z is proving to be very effective at that. But I think these environmental climate challenges, and that's very all-encompassing. That includes housing and transportation, and kind of more traditional forms of engineering and architecture and economics, and everything is really going to be impacted, I think, by that overall general theme.
Thank you for that, Jonathan. Bukky or Bernadette, you want to add to anything you said there? I know it's a loaded question.
I would have actually answered that question on a very, like, just what I've observed in general about Gen Z. I mean, because I have my junior brother is a Gen Z, and just taking him as an example. And I think that it has both advantages and disadvantages. I just feel like a lot of Gen Zs now, and I don't know if it's a thing of where they're at, but I don't want to use the word that there's sort of like a lack of focus. I don't know if that's, and I don't know if I'm, I don't know if I'm I'm trying to work on eggshells here. And I think it's because there's a change in our time. I see that for millennials, there was more focus, but I see maybe because of now the growth of digital, social media has just made things maybe better and worse in some cases. And I would say, I think it would be some sort of challenge for just Gen Z to sort of navigate and find their path, because there are lots and lots of distractions. But it can, like I said, it can be an advantage and also a disadvantage. I think it's just for them to decide what path they want to go, so.
Yep. I can agree. I mean, I see it on a daily basis with my students. The focus part, so I agree there.
Yeah.
I think the next question, I think Eric Jin he's asking to Bernadette. He's saying a lot of people go through IB internships, breaking into, what is MBB? Or
McKinsey, Bain, and
BCG.
Oh, okay. Or go into, I think, private equity or corporate development. He's saying, are you curious, on a personal level, are you curious to eventually move into those fields eventually? If not, why?
Yeah, it's a great question. I feel like it's the question that lots of people are answering at this time in the firm too, because some people come into consulting with the lens of, you do this for 2 to 3 years and then maybe you try something else. I have considered going into PE, or I should say I am considering going into PE, because I think that it's a good opportunity to, I do really enjoy finance, and I kind of wish I did a little bit more of just direct financial modeling in my job, because it's weird to say Excel gives me energy, but Excel gives me energy. So I've thought about going into PE because I think it's a good opportunity to combine more of that sort of academic finance interest with more strategic thinking around businesses. One thing that's really important to me right now, only because also I did a number of internships in IB, is having a good work-life balance. And so for me, the decision will largely be based on what the culture of the team is going to look like, because it's something that's at the top of my list. And I think it's maybe sometimes hard to get with PE, depending on what firm you end up in. So that's the big deciding factor for me. It's if I'm going to a new job, am I going to be able to maintain my work-life balance and also really enjoy the work that I'm doing? So hopefully that's helpful.
Thank you. So let me just skip over Akib's question real quick. We'll come back to that. And then I think to Bukky and both Jonathan, what are the top 2 environmental challenges that face the world today?
From my experience and just from my own personal study, I think the top 2 would be water and waste. And I don't know if you all have had the opportunity to go through the 17 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. You have about 4 to 5 or even 6 of the goals just focusing on having clean water, running water, because you have some countries where, and even parts of America, for example, typical example is the case of Flint in Michigan, And so I think that's one key issue, because that is an essential human need. Water is an essential human need, and I think that's one environmental issue we're having. And the other one, I say waste, because the volume of waste the earth is currently generating is affecting, life on land, is affecting the aquatic ecosystem, it's affecting a lot of things. So I think those are the two major challenges facing sustainability.
I would fully agree with that. The only other concern that I also weigh kind of high, maybe not totally equally, but up there for me is, again, jumping back to food, and whether or not our current systems of food production are sustainable in a climate that is drastically different, where you're seeing more widespread crop failure and things like that. And then I think that, coupled with just a very inequitable economic system in certain places, food access, I think, is going to be really critical. And then you see, whether or not you can eat, and if there's a drought going on, really impacts all other kind of factors in society. So I think that's going to be a big concern, in addition to access to water.
Yeah, I mean, I was seeing something the other day in like South, I forgot. I saw somewhere they were running out of water or something like that, and it was a big deal. But yeah, I mean, I know that the water thing is huge. I just don't know if people here pretty, I don't know if there's that much awareness about it. So thank you for that. Rakib, you can go ahead and come off of mute and go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you. So to Bernadette, I had a question about consulting. So Bain is one of the top 3 most prestigious consulting firms. So I was wondering, in terms of academics, like what colleges, experiences like internships, careers, and then also like the interviews, like what can I do to best position myself to be competitive for these very competitive firms?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Rakib. I think the things that apply to probably most industries is doing well in college and having a strong academic performance. Outside of that, I would say it's also really helpful to talk to people that are currently at Bain or McKinsey, BCG, whatever firms you're interested in. One, to understand more about what their role looks like, but then also two, so that when the recruiting process is happening, you're top of mind for them, you voice your interest to them, and then they can follow up with you, say, okay, we're starting the summer recruiting. I think it's helpful to have some of that personal relationship with people that are at the firm to learn about what they do, but also so that you have people that are thinking of you as top of mind throughout the recruiting process. So I would say leverage career services, but also really leverage LinkedIn. Like a lot of the reaching out I did when I was looking to get into Bain was actually connecting with people that were on LinkedIn, people that I felt had maybe similar backgrounds or had lived in similar places. I was like, oh, you also lived in Johannesburg? Hi, for no reason, oh, you went to WashU, people that went to the same schools, right? So I think that a lot of recruiting kind of ends up being reaching out to people. And I know that's not always the most comfortable thing for everyone. At least it wasn't for me, because I'm sort of introverted by nature. And I felt like I was disturbing them. But now being on the other side of it, it's actually what everybody does, turns out. I just assumed it would be a disturbance, but a lot of people reach out and say, if you have a few minutes, we'd love to learn about your role. And I think that one gives you good clarity on the role, so that you can solidify, okay, this is something I definitely want to do. And then two, also gives you someone that's on the inside that's kind of thinking of you and has you as top of mind.
Yeah, I'd like to add some points to what Bernadette just said there. And it would be to just improve yourself personally. And I think that's a good way to be on the top of the list, regardless of what industry, regardless of what company that you aim to sort of go into. And by developing yourself, I mean just being part of an organization in school, volunteering, taking up leadership roles, because that's a good way for you to build your skills even before you start all of these internships. How do you work in teams? Because even in the workforce or in the working industry, you're not going to be doing a project by yourself. You're going to be with a team, right? How do you collaborate? How do you communicate? So it's good to start to build those skills so you can actually show that you have these skills, and then you can be on top of the list for whatever company that you're aiming for. So.
Thank you.
Yep. Thank you. So I think we'll have two more questions and then we'll finish up. So I'll start with Rishi's question. Pretty interesting here. He says, do you see entertainment such as movies and video games as a viable vessel to raise awareness on these issues in a meaningful way?
So Jonathan, go ahead.
No, go for it.
I had a clarifying question, which Jonathan might already know the answer to. Are we talking about sustainability issues? That's what this question is targeted at.
I think that's what the question,
Yeah,
right?
I think maybe sustainability, environment issues. Yeah, he said yes.
You said yes, yeah.
Yes. My short answer is yes. Only because I think for me, I actually think that movies for me have been a great learning tool for many issues that I maybe have not thought about as deeply. I think when when you sort of, to what Jonathan was saying earlier, appeal to the emotional part of people and make people confront what the long-term impact of things staying in the status quo could be, it leads to more change. And I think movies are actually a really effective way to do that, or at least have been for me.
Yeah, I mean, I think I can second that as well, because actually that water thing that I was talking about was, I think I watched it on Vox on Netflix. They have a pretty good, series. And it was called, I think, Day Zero, something about South Africa running out of water. And that's how I learned about. So I definitely agree. I think movies, I think games, and anything in situation is great to raise awareness. And I think this is going to be the last question here. Following up to the food environmental problem, do you see moving to plant-based diets as a more sustainable form of living?
I think.
No, go ahead, Jonathan. Go ahead.
Thank you. I think, yes, I think shifting kind of what our diets are on a large, macro level has a huge impact. I mean, just the amount of space needed for some factory farming for cattle and things is pretty shocking. I don't know if you would necessarily require an entirely plant-based diet, but definitely shifting kind of what we prioritize for crops has a big effect. But I'm not I'm not a farming expert, so I'm probably missing a lot of nuance here. But I know making sure crops are being properly rotated is a big issue too, because we have a lot of just land that really can't produce anymore because it was just so heavily farmed in the exact same manner for an extended period of time. And so I know a big environmental concern is just us running out of fertile ground, basically. And there are some studies out there. I think the UK government did a study about this actually more recently. I see, can farms be grown in the ocean? The salt content in the sea spray is a little rough for plants, but that type of, hydroponics and things and kind of growing things inside and in alternate ways is definitely possible.
To answer that question, that's a very, it can get a little bit personal in terms of shifting to plant-based, because I for one know that the water and the energy footprint for some certain types of farming is way higher than some certain types of farming. So for me, I would say to create reduction in probably consumption of some certain types of food that require very high water and energy footprint. And that way it can be more sustainable, because really you cannot just tell people, oh, you have to stop eating meat, you have to stop eating chicken, those types of things. Like it gets really personal, and it's like, okay, I've been eating this, since birth, how can you just tell me, So I would say just, creating the awareness of reduction can help. And to answer the question of farms, being grown on the ocean, I would say I don't think so. But in environmental engineering, people have started to take water from oceans and treat them via desalination plants. I think there's a desalination plant in California, although I heard there's a lot of emissions and lots of treatment that has to go through the entire process. But that's a new thing coming up in the environmental engineering space, just using desalination to treat ocean water.
Great, thank you. So I think that'll do it for our panel 3 here for the Leadership and Service series hosted by PEAC and Global Shapers. If any of your friends were not able to make this, but they wanted to view this recording will be on YouTube later. We will be posting highlights as well. So please share with any students, any high school, college students that would be interested in this. And we hope to see you all for the next panel. Again, thank you to our great panelists for taking time out of their day to come and speak to us. We really appreciate it, guys.
Yeah, this was fun. Thanks all.
Yep. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Hope you guys have a great day. See ya.
You as well.
Thank you. You too.
Bye.